Hi guys, here Gabby again. Today we're going to talk about minimal APIs in microservices in .NET ecosystem, and I have something to say. Most APIs do not get complex because of business logic. APIs get complex because of unnecessary structure, and that's why I stopped using controllers in microservices. Minimal API is a lighter and more direct way to expose HTTP endpoints in .NET. It removes most of the boilerplate that comes with controllers and attributes. Instead of hiding behavior behind attributes, I defined endpoints explicitly and declarative. I choose minimal API in microservices because the endpoints usually are very simple. The real logic lives in other layers, as for example, application, infrastructure, or whatever, okay? And not in the API. The minimal API fits perfectly with clean architecture when the API is just a transport layer. As in the previous video, we talked about API, other layers, and the thin of the layer of the API, and that the API must not be fat, that it only should have, for example, contracts, request, parameters, responses, using of mappers to intermediate DTOs, data transfer DTOs, the middleware, and so on. But for example, a useful case of an endpoint could be we receive the request, we validate the request, we transform it to an intermediate DTO to move it to another inner layer, for example, infrastructure or application. Yes, we do the execution, we do the work, we do the business logic, we pass it through the other layer, we receive a response, and then we map it to a response, and we throw it or we return it to the UI or to the client. Okay, so um, um, in microservices controllers, I was thinking about controllers because we are talking about minimal APIs, and in microservices the controllers usually bring attributes everywhere, implicit behavior, more ceremony than value, and on the other hand, when we use minimal API, we get less code, more control of the HTTP pipeline. The endpoints are easier to read and reason about. They are scoped to themselves. They have everything they need. It's one unit. It's separated. It's okay. We can use with minimal API and microservices in .NET Core, for example, the routing, the group routing, the versioning, and so on. And it's very useful to separate use of cases and the core behavior of that microservices. So when we open a minimal API endpoint, we immediately see what's going on, okay? And we have an organization, okay? So if we have a problem like the first fear of the people is, hey, why won't everything look cluttered? Okay, so the solution is it's cluttered because you don't organize it well. Okay, you need to organize your endpoints using, as I said recently, root groups, extension methods, and classes per feature. Okay, so even with minimal API, the structure stays clean and predictable. Okay, so as I already said before about validation, another common mistake is try to do everything in the endpoint. Okay, for example, the validation we can do it in the API, but also it can be done in the application layer. The key is not to put responsibilities at the API level. The validation can be handled with a tool, a library, or a pattern, fluent validation, either in the application layer or in the pipeline behaviors. That's a possibility, but we can do the validation in the application layer and so on. For example, we receive the request, we 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 do a validation and of the model and so on. Um, Talking about the validation, then we talk about the mapping to a data transfer object in the intermediate level, as for example, the mapping is done at the edges using Mapster, API to application, and the application back to the API. No, we receive a request, we receive a contract, we receive a parameter, we receive a query or whatever, we transform it, we map it to an internal DTO, and then the DTO and that DTO lives in the application, and the application can can work with it because, as I said in other videos, the API references infrastructure and application, but the application does not reference API because if not, we have a circular referent and it's not work. It's not um, worth uh, for us. Okay, guys. Um, Other thing is what's going on with us about errors. The errors are handled globally. For example, in the middleware. We use middleware that transforms the exceptions into problem details because, for example, we could use it's a mix of both. I work recently in a project where I implemented a result pattern where the result pattern was about an entity called result or result T. That's a generic uh, result of any type. Okay, and that result can have any state and a factory to create those results. Okay, success, forbidden, I don't know, stay different result types vinculated to HTTP responses or failures or whatever, but that result lived in the domain. But eventually, when we return it, we need it to be clear to the UI, to the front end, to the mobile team, to whatever, and a standard could be use the problem details. So if we have an error, we can have a result error or whatever, and we throw it or we return it, and we use the middleware that transforms exceptions into problem details. So endpoints stay clean because they only orchestrate the request. That's it. Another thing to talk about in minimal APIs that I said before is the security. We have the authorization layer and the authentication layer. Okay, the security in minimal API works exactly the same as the controllers. Nothing changed. I still use, we can use, for example, in the program.des file or in an extension or whatever, we use the use authentication and use authorization. At the endpoint or group level, we can apply policies or requirements or attributes to validate. And the minimal API does not limit the security in any way. Okay, so it only changes how endpoints are defined. We can talk about an example. Okay, for example, in one of our projects, some root groups were protected by JWTs with specific claims, and that was defined once in the map group level without repeating security code per endpoint. So we have a cleaner code and we have the same security guarantees. Okay, and this has a payoff, as we can say. Okay, about minimal APIs closing the topic. The minimal APIs can help us to keep the API thin, to make an explicit behavior of what we are going to do. We reduce the boilerplate and it aligns perfectly with clean architecture. Okay, the clear objective is that the API must be easy to maintain, easier to reason about, and it has to be clear what is the main function to resolve with the business with the business logic. Okay, um, and that's it. I'm Gabby. I'm a developer. I like to write microservices, and I am focused in .NET ecosystem. And I hope this helps to you and is useful. If you like, save the video, put a comment, or give a like. It also helps. And have a good day. Bye bye.